Thank you, and although it's an honor, it's a somewhat unenviable position to be in to follow Professor Wubels. I've obviously read quite a bit of his research in grad school at Michigan, and I graduated from college actually out in Utah 20 years ago. I was late to grad school. I spent my time in communications and political consulting in Ohio and around the country, served, as Michael alluded to, 8 years on Toledo City Council. And I wish I knew then what I know now after 3 years in Ann Arbor. For the past 5 years, I've worked as a policy and organizer for the National Wildlife Federation. It's a great institution. We have affiliates in Wyoming and Florida and in about 47 states around the country. Our mission is to inspire Americans to protect wildlife and habitat for our children's future. We've been around actually since 1936. It was a brainchild of Franklin Roosevelt and Harold Ickes, who was the Secretary of Interior. My task today is to talk about water impacts from climate change, and I'm going to focus primarily on the United States. I live in Toledo, I mentioned, work in Great Lakes, but want to sort of broaden the scope of the conversation today. Tomorrow, we're going to focus more on the Great Lakes region itself. But again, at the risk of following Dr. Wubels on the science, I thought that it would be important to start with sort of a coarse general climate conversation about the impacts of climate on water, talk about national impacts, and then work our way down to sort of regional and other impacts. What I have up here is from an aptly named webpage on the U.S. EPA site called Climate Impacts on Water. And what you'll see in here are, I think to trained eyes, stories waiting to be written in different parts of the country. Increase in sediment and runoff. As more heavy precipitation falls, it's pushing more sediment off farm fields and into the mouths of rivers. In the city of Toledo, for instance, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is forced to dredge more and more, costing money and creating a problem where to put the sediment. And that's happening in ports not just in Toledo, but around the Great Lakes and around the country. Ports face severe challenges in sort of forecasting capital investments when they look out over the course of the next 25, 30, 40, 50 years. Any variation in water level impacts how much cargo can be loaded at ports. And so, that type of, water changes outside variability towards the climate models going forward puts port planners at a disadvantage. And that's happening not just in the United States, but around the country. As temperatures warm, you're going to see less snow, and you're going to see more rain. It stands to reason. As the rain happens more frequently in higher elevations, what we're seeing is that there's damages to, for instance, trout streams, streams that folks that I represent care about. If you're from Wyoming, which relies on tourism dollars to come to fish the Snake River and other places, they're seeing, again, less snowpack, more rainfall, and it's hurting the streams. Decrease in lake ice. We just got through an extremely frigid winter here in the Great Lakes, as Michael can attest. But climate change is not a linear process. It's nonlinear, and you have to look at the trends. And the fact of the matter is, the Great Lakes are experiencing less ice cover over the course of the past 20 or 30 years. Again, that's putting water infrastructure at risk and impacts the reproduction of such things as the Lake Superior whitefish, which puts its eggs near the shore and has traditionally relied on the ice cover in the winter to allow those eggs to remain stable and for those fry to mature. Without the lake ice, you're getting more winter wave activity, and it's having a negative impact on native species of fish in the Great Lakes. There are other examples here of impacts. Generally, hotter and drier conditions in the interior west, hotter and wetter conditions in the northeast of the coasts, and it should be the Great Lakes as well. I grabbed this from the World Bank, a 2010 development report, and it shows changes in average annual runoff around the world in percentages by mid-century, and this is water availability. And I wanted to show, just as by way of comparison, what the United States is facing compared to, say, the Middle East, Europe, North Africa, South Africa. Light blue shows water availability gain. Obviously, the oranges and the reds show varying degrees of less water availability by mid-century. The white, as it was in Professor Wobel's slides, the models don't agree on the changes. What this means is that there are areas of the world that are going to be leading in figuring out solutions for this. Desalination plants, which are going to be very costly. Tradable water rights, which are already happening in South America, parts of the Middle East, and in the western United States. We're here in Chicago, the home of the Chicago Board of Trade, and there's a Swiss derivatives group that's actually working on water futures contracts. Where there's supply and demand problems and imbalances, a market is going to be made. And whether that is your idea of a dystopian future for water futures or good sound supply and demand response, I'll leave up to you. But changes are happening as far as the supply and the demand of fresh water for primarily agriculture, industry, and domestic uses. Professor Wobel's already showed this slide, but it's an important slide for us to talk about when it comes to water. I think he mentioned that many of these are outside the observed variability, particularly in the Great Lakes, New England, and the Southeast. He mentioned this is the top 1% events for heavy rainfall. You're looking at 2-inch rainfalls, 3-inch rainfalls. Last month there was a community southwest of Chicago that had an 8-inch rainfall in 24 hours. That's a big impact. The storm hit Detroit in August. The flooding there created a public health crisis. And I think folks know that those types of climate impacts disproportionately impact folks who are the least resilient. So you're going to have folks, people of color, people with mobility issues, children. I'd encourage you to explore the environmental justice literature to talk about the disproportionate impacts of climate impacts on folks. So obviously we saw that with Katrina, we saw it with Sandy, but it's also happening in Detroit. And conversely, for folks out west where there's drought, think about who is bearing the disproportionate impact of lack of water. Again, this is from the National Climate Assessment, and it just shows the projected change in heavy precipitation events if in a continued emissions increase scenario. Where I'm from in Ohio, we're going to see more storms in the Pacific Northwest and through Appalachia. So what does this mean for water managers? The American Society for Civil Engineers puts out a report card every year, every other year, and it talks about such things as the power grid, port infrastructure. But I chose to look at their recommendations on investments in drinking water, wastewater, and what they call high hazard dams. Now, this is both a problem and an opportunity. These numbers are in billions, and I just selected the states in the Great Lakes Basin. But Illinois requires $15 billion in drinking water upgrades. Because of these more frequent heavy storms that are happening, well, factoring in the heavy precipitation events, they're going to have to factor those in when they spend $17.5 billion on their wastewater upgrades.
You're not attributing every one of those dollars to climate change.
Oh, no. I'm saying that this is an opportunity, and the fact is that the people who design these projects are going to have to factor in these changes when they spend this money. So one of the questions is, how to pay for water upgrades. There's some talk of creating a Tennessee Valley Authority bonding type institution to help states and local ratepayers pay for these upgrades. That's the federal government getting involved, and these states signed an agreement about in 2006, 2007 to not allow water diversions to happen outside the basin. That was at a time when there was sort of a record low water table, water levels in the lakes. And there was also concern about calls from the American West for literal pipelines coming from Lake Michigan and Lake Superior out to Arizona and other places. Now, if the federal government gets more involved, obviously they're involved in through the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative and returning infrastructure dollars to the Great Lakes. Will calls for diversions because of drought out west, it possibly increase in the future. It's a question that it's called sort of the third rail of Great Lakes politics, water diversions. I wanted to mention sort of how we manage the water that we have. There's an EPA rule going through the process right now called the Waters of the U.S. rule. What it seeks to do is clarify rules surrounding wetlands, and I hope to hear from. Got about 1 minute. Hope to hear from Jerry. Maybe he can touch on that. But we're going to have to be a lot more careful about how we use our wetlands in the face of climate change. Wetlands provide buffer strips to reduce stormwater runoff and agricultural runoff. They also provide habitat for waterfowl, and they're also very good carbon sequestration. Very good at carbon sequestration. For people who like to pheasant hunt and duck hunt, the protection of these wetlands are important, and it has a role in climate. I'm just going to end with one more local impact, climate and water, and that has to do with harmful algal blooms. I think folks have heard about what happened in Toledo. We lost the ability to use our water for 3 days, 2.5 days. Increasing heavy rainfall in the Maumee Bay watershed, plus changing land use and wetlands loss, plus non-source pollution, which is the phosphorus from farm fields, helps fuel algal blooms. I would just refer folks to Dr. Jay Martin from Ohio State. He says that climate change is going to exacerbate this through longer growing seasons. From the perspective of the climate model, showing greater winter and spring runoff and higher CO2 emissions and higher concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere, increasing photosynthesis. It's not just a Toledo problem. These are places where harmful algal blooms have broken out around the country just in 2013. I'd ask you to pay particular attention to the Raccoon River in Des Moines, also out in the Pacific Northwest. A lot of harmful algal blooms in New England. Right now, there's no national standard for monitoring or reporting. We're going to have to get our act together on it. I'll be around for questions.
Excellent. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you.
That was excellent.
Good.